Yuma, good afternoon. I'm Dan Borscher and welcome to this webinar asking the question, why is an Indigenous voice so important in Australia, as part of these broader conversations being had about a pathway to a voice, what it could and would look like, how it could operate, and what would be the implications or processes from there. There's been a very long process so far, and this is a part of that conversation. As we start, I want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal traditional owners and custodians of this land that I'm on in Canberra, those traditional owners who have maintained culture, care for country and storytelling and songlines for time immemorial here in Canberra, and share that with the entire community right now. So I want to pay particular tribute to them, but also other elders, other nations that you're joining in from around Australia, and other elders and First Nations people that might be joining us today as part of this very big conversation. And to get into that very soon, you're going to be hearing from Professor Daryl Rigney and Miss Fiona McLeod, AOSC, and the Honourable Jeff Kennett, AC, who all had a role in the deliberations and discussions, the conversations and listening to what was being said around the nation. Well, today it's time for some questions and a chat. And on that note, you can get more information, including the entire interim report and lots of ways of looking at that information at voice.niaa.gov.au. And I would encourage you to have a look at that to get us started. Let's have a look at this video that gives a sense of where we're at right now.
The voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been a part of this land for over 65,000 years. And yet, in Australia's recent history, our voices haven't always been heard when it comes to the creation of laws, policies and services that impact our lives.
In 2017, the Uluru Statement from the Heart reaffirmed the need for a national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representative body. A body that would serve as a voice to Parliament and Government.
A voice to Parliament and Government is important. It provides a way for our representatives to give advice to Government on things that matter to us and affect us.
It gives people from our communities a stronger way to have their say.
Over the last year, 3 groups, made up of mostly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples,
have worked with Government to develop proposals on how an Indigenous voice can best work in Australia.
The Indigenous voice would be a way for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians to share our views with the Parliament and the Government, and to work in partnership.
To have our voices heard on matters that impact us, and to make decisions and improve local services and outcomes together.
The proposed Indigenous voice is made of 2 important parts that would work together: the local and regional voice and the national voice.
A local and regional voice would be a community-designed and led governance structure. They would work in partnership with all levels of government, providing advice on the design and delivery of programs, policies and services for the region. Local and regional voices would be guided by a flexible, principles-based framework. This would allow for different structures in different regions. It would respond to the diverse circumstances of our people and build on existing arrangements that work well.
The national voice would be a national advisory body made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We're asking you to consider how membership to the body could work.
The National Voice would provide advice to the Parliament and Australian Government on laws, policies and programs.
It would be involved early and throughout the development of processes, ensuring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives are considered before decisions are made. It's now up to you. We want to hear your feedback on how the proposals would best work for you and for your community.
An Indigenous voice is a step towards lasting change for our future and for the future of our young people. Make sure to have your say and have your voice heard.
And you can do that by going onto the website. There are surveys and ways to fill out submissions to be involved in this conversation. But part of that is hearing from those that have been sitting around the table, along with Professors Marcia and Tom, looking at these very questions. And with us today is Professor Darryl Rigney, who was on the Senior Advisory Group. A Senior Advisory Group member, is a Ngarrindjeri Nation citizen and serves as the Director of Indigenous Nations and Collaborative Futures Research at Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology in Sydney. And for many years, he's worked on nation building with Indigenous leaders locally, nationally and internationally, as well as the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority as a spokesperson on treaty negotiations in 2018, and as well as being across the private and public sector. And a Director of the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, Senior Fellow, Atlantic Fellows and Social Equity, and member of the University of Arizona's Native Nations Institute Indigenous Advisory Council. Yuma, welcome.
Thank you, Dan.
Great to have you along. Also here is Ms. Fiona McLeod, AOSC, who was part of the National Co-Design Group as a member, a Senior Counsellor of the Victorian Bar and former President of the Law Council of Australia and the Australian Bar Association. Ms. McLeod led the class action into the Murrindindi Black Saturday bushfires and the Commonwealth legal team in the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, the Queensland Floods Commission and Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sex Abuse, representing the whole of government in each matter. Ms. McLeod received an Officer of the Order of Australia in the year 2000 for distinguished service to the law and legal profession at both the national and the international level. Yuma, welcome.
Thank you.
And also with us on the panel today is the Honourable Jeff Kennett, AC, also a member of the National Co-Design Group. The Honourable Jeff Kennett was an officer of the Royal Australian Regiment serving at home and overseas, a Premier of Victoria from 1992 to 1999, a member of the Victorian Parliament for 23 years, Leader of the Opposition from 82 to 89 and 91 to 92. Mr Kennett's Chair of Open Windows Australia, CT Management Group, a Director of Amtech Corporation, and the founder and former Chair of Beyond Blue. Mr Kennett's also chair of The Torch, and this is a program that assists incarcerated Indigenous men and women post their release. He's also the president of the Hawthorn Football Club and received a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2005 for service to the Victorian Parliament and the introduction of initiatives for economic and social benefit to business and commerce and to the community in the development of the arts, sport and mental health awareness strategies. Yuma, Jeff, welcome.
Great pleasure.
Great to have you all here. I think we'll start by asking why a voice is important to Australia. Darryl, I want to start with you on this one.
Thanks, Dan. And just before I begin, I want to acknowledge leaders, elders and community from Indigenous nations across the land. I'm sitting in the lands of the Kaurna Nation in Adelaide. As I said, or as it said in the introduction, I've been working in Indigenous nation building for quite some time, thinking about strategies of self-determination, and part of that process is to try and create relationships that are not colonising in nature and that allow Indigenous populations to grow and to develop and to be healthier and better, frankly. And so the work of the voice is very important in being able to establish a new relationship with the broader Australian community in order to take up that effort about improving the lives of Indigenous peoples across the country.
Fiona, why is a voice important to you?
I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners. I'm on Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging across this land. I myself am not an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. I was a member of the National Voice Co-Design Group. And for me, it was my work as a barrister and also as President of the Law Council over many years working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, seeing firsthand the justice impacts of the failure of access to justice, the incarceration of our First Nations people at shocking rates, and the inability of communities to have a direct voice into laws, policies and practices that directly affected them. I conducted a justice project when I was President of the Law Council, and it was the issue that came up over and over for me, as it did in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, of the need to have a direct voice to speak about policies and practices that were directly affecting people, and particularly in that criminal justice sphere. So my input has been largely around the issues of legislative tools and parliamentary processes, and to support the Indigenous leaders who've been around the table.
And Jeff, for you, what's the importance of a voice?
Can I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, their leaders, past, present and future. My first experience was when I became Minister for Aboriginal Affairs back in the early 80s, and have been involved in a minor way with the community ever since. And I suppose in my time as chair of Beyond Blue, and I saw so much discrimination, so much weighting of incarceration, sadly suicides, that quite clearly I've come to the conclusion a long time ago that we need to better understand the cultures of our First People. And it's interesting, isn't it, that yesterday we had marches throughout Australia demanding, wishing greater respect for women. And that's long overdue, and I support their objectives. But I keep asking myself, at a time when we've had so much good social reform in this country in the last 20 years, so we've now passed overwhelmingly referendums for same-sex marriage, we've introduced a national disability scheme which recognises those with disadvantages and their families, and now I think this movement for greater respect for women will continue to build and have an effect. I ask myself, where is the same community interest in respect for our First Peoples across the board? And that recognises that there are a lot in our First communities who are doing very well in selecting to follow professions in the other part of Australian life, but there are many who get most of the publicity for the problems facing the community. And I see the voice as being the next step to give recognition to the First Peoples, and also to give respect and learnings to the culture, because I think there's so much about Indigenous culture which, if we allowed the communities to apply them, would overcome some of the aspects of Indigenous life, such as suicide, such as breaking the law that we're experiencing today. So even though not everyone in the Indigenous community agrees with the voice, to me it is the next natural step to gaining that national recognition that I think First Peoples deserve.
Daryl, when you hear that, I wonder if that also rings true of the sentiment or the view that solutions need to be grassroots up rather than top down.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the questions I had to ask myself when the opportunity to be a part of this process came up was, why would I do it? I've been working in nation building work for a long time, which was around ideas of self-determination, of governance, of self-government, and did this process go far enough, frankly, in terms of what was important to me. And when I tried to think about that and tried to think about what was going on in this country, Indigenous self-determination is widespread in terms of the Indigenous population. It's collective. It's been about rebuilding our communities and our nations. It's actually about power and voice. It's positional. And by that, I mean, it's not just about a race relationship, but thinking about what is the political relationship that we need to have in this country. And how does that sit within this process? Indigenous populations have all said it's not about being secessionist or breaking away, but how do we be collaborative in such a way that it's respectful and that those relationships are actually respectful. But that effort's been severely constrained for a whole bunch of reasons that many of us have researched and tried to understand. And so, when in that kind of context, why did I do it? Why did I get involved? I did so because I think that we actually have to think about how do you position yourselves in order to be have the tools and the mechanisms in which to be able to express the things that are important to you. And if it means some incrementalism and some small steps to get there, even if it's not the full distance as I would like to have seen it, then I'm prepared to back that, because I think we need to be heard on important matters as we try to secure our lives in ways that we want to live them. not necessarily in the way that others might think we should live them. And so that was really important to me as part of that process.
I want to come back to that point about small steps, perhaps as part of a longer journey, because I suspect I know what you're referring to there, a bigger conversation about other issues, treaty constitutionality and the like. We'll come back to that in a tick. But first, Fiona, I want to go to you. We've just got a text in modern Australia, Indigenous Australians are part of the fabric of the country, thus a very broad church, rural, urban, rich, poor, conservative, liberal, straight, gay, etc. If the voice provides advice on, quote, in quotations, relevant issues, every government policy would seem relevant. That doesn't seem to be the proposed intent. How will relevance be determined by the voice representatives or government?
That's a very good question, because obviously all laws, policies and practices can potentially impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. What we settled on as the guiding principle, and this is of course subject to your views about it, was that the core function would be to advise on matters of critical importance to the social, spiritual and economic well-being, or which has a significant or particular impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of national significance. But given that broad scope, then the national voice would set its own priorities. So its priorities might be to look at national delivery of services, for example, housing, issues of incarceration, health issues, or it might look at something that's multi-governmental, so where there's an impact at local, state and national levels. And this is where the local and regional voice would have an input as well. So it's a body that will decide for itself what its priorities are. I can imagine, for example, that the winding back of the Race Discrimination Act for the intervention would be an issue that would have excited a body like the Voice to have a say and to point to the impact or likely impact the intervention would have, and those emergency measures would have on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Another one might be the cashless welfare cards, things of that nature that are coming before Parliament that would ordinarily excite the interests of the Voice. So it can set its own priorities. It can work out which issues to work on. Government could refer things to it to seek advice, but it wouldn't be restrained in terms of the issues that it sought to make representations about. That's the model that we've designed, and we're certainly interested in people's views about functions.
Jeff, I want to go to you on this one as well around, I guess, the scope that question really went to of what is the art of the possible.
As Fiona said, it's not for us who are designing the scheme to then decide or put in place borders around what the Voice might be able to do. And they've got to use their judgment based on the priorities that they see of the day, the month, the year. And I would hate to limit them in terms of what they do. And given that the Voice then has behind it the regional community input, they're not going to be able to take on board everything. They're going to make decisions based on need, urgency, etc. And I have great confidence that those who are elected and maybe one or two selected to join the Voice will want to make this work. We don't want another Indigenous body like ATSIC that fails. We want something that really gives hope to the community as a whole, is respected by the parliamentarians regardless of their politics or their religion or their background, and to build over the years to come. Because if this doesn't work this time, then I think, again, we'd take so many steps backward, it would be a great pity. So this is an opportunity where men and women will make judgments based on the urgency and the importance of the matters that they see fit to discuss.
Daryl, on that balancing act, I guess that's the great challenge as well as the opportunity, isn't it, of being something, as Jeff said, that is respected by the parliamentarians of whatever stripes they are. It's something that is actually achieving and is focused on positivity of doing things, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, and I agree with Fiona and Jeff, and Indigenous communities, nations at the local and regional level will make decisions about the things that are important to them and will feed them up through the system. I think one of the opportunities this presents is for organisation at the local and regional level, and I think it's a really important thing in ways that it doesn't, that it's complementary to and supportive of the mechanisms that currently exist, such that it then becomes an opportunity to think about how do we collectively put forward those things that feed into, from local and regional, feed into a national body that then goes on to have voice at Parliament and voice in government.
Fiona, we heard just a moment ago from Jeff about ATSEC. There is some level of distrust across First Nations communities because of things that have happened in the past. How important is the trust building, I guess, as part of this process, but ultimately to whatever the voice becomes?
Well, trust is critically important, both trust in the mechanism that the voice will be listened to, and that government and Parliament will listen to the advice that's been given, and that there are tools available, parliamentary processes, to ensure that the advice is tabled, it's reported on, it's taken into account in terms of relevant legislation, using various parliamentary accountability mechanisms, but also that the voice is accountable to the communities who have elected or those members, so that there's a reporting back, an ability to report back down to those communities who they represent. So there's got to be a line of accountability both ways, and openness about the way that they're dealing and acting on things. There's got to be openness from government as well about consulting and seeking advice, not seeking to veto or give directions to the voice in any particular way. Ultimately, decisions for government are decisions for government. If they act on the advice or choose not to act on the advice, that's a matter for them that the electors can express their views about each time an election comes around. But so long as you've got those accountability measures in place and people can track the relationship between the voice and government and between voice and Parliament, then that of itself should build trust, the openness of those dealings. We have looked pretty closely at the membership, and it is one thing that we're very interested in getting community views about, how you appoint members to the voice. And that's where people have different views, because there's a diverse range of communities. Some have traditional owners represent them, some elect representatives to various representative bodies or councils or boards. And so that mechanism of constitution of the voice and how you build trust with the individual communities is also a very important piece of work.
Well, I think that leads perfectly to the...
Can I just add, sorry, to Fiona's comment? I think what's important is that one of the suggestions is that we have a representative there from those Indigenous community members who are disadvantaged, and secondly from the youth, because the youth might not win elections around the country, but they are increasingly a larger proportion of the totality of the Indigenous community. And I think the fact that the discussions have allowed not only for a body of people to come up from grassroots, but there are two groups that need special recognition, and I think that's very worthwhile.
Do you want to add to the trust question as well, Jeff, while we've got you?
Well, I can't add much more. I don't think trust is everything. It's reputation. It's reputation. It's trust. It's respect, and that's why I think those who will ultimately serve on the voice have a huge job in front of them to generate and to earn that trust. We've now got more Indigenous members of Parliament, but of course they're elected to represent whole electorates. They're not just there to represent the Indigenous cause. But I hope that the voice will be seen and receive bipartisan support, because if the parliamentarians recognise the value of the torch, that helps establish the respect and the trust that we're all talking about today.
And Darryl, just to round out that the trust discussion, how important do you see that as being, and how at risk could it be?
In some of the consultations that I've sat on to date, the question of trust was a large issue, and often reflections on efforts in the past to promote opportunity or structures that allow for Indigenous voice or Indigenous decision making to occur. And there, I think it's, for many there is mistrust. People have asked, well, where's the guarantee in this? And there is no guarantee. What we've got before us is an opportunity to create something, as outlined in the interim report, both at local and regional. So, and that's really important to think. Some of the questions I've just noticed in the Q&A we're talking to, how does a national body of 16 to 18 people be able to represent the large continuum of issues that the population faces and may face into the future. And so the point is that there will be a national body, as outlined, and the local and regional body is equally as critical, because a lot of the work that goes on in relation to local government, state governments, happens at the local and regional level. So the two mechanisms work in collaboration with one another, and the opportunity then to take things of a national issue up from local and regional is there in that system. So that, it's not, we have to put some number around it, and the proposal does that. It's seeking feedback from the community around what those numbers look like to address these very issues, but that's what we've got before us.
And Fiona, that question that's come in is around the 16 to 18 people only this is on the National Voice. How is it possible this body will have enough critical mass to represent such a wide range of regional, urban, remote voices and deal with so many issues, keeping in mind the Australian Parliament has approximately 150 members of the House of Reps? Fiona, you started talking about this earlier, about this being kind of part of the broader tapestry, I guess, of the voice.
So 16 to 18 or 20 or I think 20 was mentioned in one place. The number of the voice was selected to be both representative and effective. So I don't think there's a magic number. That was our view about where we thought an effective board could be effectively. But don't forget that the national voice is supported at the local and regional level by another body which represents those individual communities. And you could either have those individual communities which with a far greater number of representatives then electing the voice from their number or from elsewhere in their communities. So it's supported, and this is, I think this is very important to have the reach at that micro level into the communities, into local government, into communities, whether they're urban or rural and so on, to have those, that direct contact to each of the communities so that there is literally a voice travelling up the line to the peak body. The size, it's really a question of what's workable, and each of us have sat on different boards from time to time and had our own experience. I remember the Law Council, I think at one point got up to 30 people, which was difficult for people to really engage with issues in substance during meetings. But it's just a matter of our experience, and it may not represent yours. It may be that each of the participants here and those in the community have different views about the size of things and what can work. So that is something that we're looking for input onto too. There's a crucial piece of work here really about how the local and regional bodies interact with the national voice. And to make it work effectively, that really has to be a smooth path of communication.
And you touched on there about some of the connections. So I'll just stay with you for a tick. Ruth has asked, the state and local Aboriginal land council networks provide a mechanism for voice at all levels, remote, regional, urban. Why not leverage this existing statutory function?
Yeah.
But that's an option on the table as well, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. So in New South Wales, in WA, those land councils work very effectively, in some places in Queensland, but there are different mechanisms in different places. So, for example, in Victoria, we now have a First Nations Assembly, which includes many representatives from different communities, but not all, because some people have opted not to participate in that process. So it's about using the diverse means of representation that are already out there, because they may suit communities, and being able to cobble together a solution that reflects what those communities want to be their mode of representation. And it's really quite, for a law nerd, it's really quite exciting to have a body that can reflect differences in the way people are represented, and yet have each of them content that that model is serving them and will serve them in terms of their pathway up to a representative body.
I want to open the next question up to all three of the panellists. I'll start, Daryl, with you. This one from Romain. How do each of the three panellists and the other 49 members of the Senior Advisory Group, the national and local regional co-design groups, expect to officially respond in your final report to the fact that most of the submissions made public to date on the NIAA Voice website seem to have come from non-Indigenous Australians who bemoan the government determination that the Uluru Statement from the Heart, including a constitutionally enshrinement, is out of scope from your terms of reference? Daryl?
Not quite sure how to respond to that question. This process that we're undertaking at the moment, and the consultative process, these webinars, the Q&As that are here, are all designed to receive feedback on the proposal as it's been developed. Where that moves from after we receive comment from around the country is that they will be considered within each of the working groups, the local and regional, national working group, to the senior advisory group, after which a response will be able to be developed based on what's been provided to us. The terms of reference for this work is such that the constitutional question is not part of the terms of reference. That was made clear. How that's managed within the group is something that I would have some views on, but would want to sit with the broader group to understand how we might respond.
Jeff, I want to bring you in on this one. Was it a missed opportunity not including some sort of constitutionality to the body?
No, far from it. I think this is a step towards a more informed debate on recognition. And my worry is if this fails, then it'll make any recognition that much more difficult. So this is like building a pyramid. Just going back to Fiona's comment about 20 people or whoever make up the number on The Voice, I have been getting some criticism. No, some non-Indigenous people have been putting out materials that this body will have the right to overrule government legislation, etc., regulations. And Fiona made the point quite succinctly that that isn't the role of The Voice. And one of the reasons to keep The Voice to an efficient number of people is to make sure people don't go around saying you're establishing another parliament. This is not another parliament. This is an advisory body to government and from government, representing Indigenous interests. So I think it's an exciting concept. I'd like to think that by the time consultation has finished, we'll get that bipartisan support. Importantly, as I say, I fear, and I get, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but there's a lot of opinions within the Indigenous community for and against The Voice itself. But if we don't get this up, then I think you're putting back by many years the opportunity to advance the arguments that came out of the statement from the heart.
And we will go to some of those issues in just a moment. But Fiona, I want to bring you in to round out that question there about the constitutionality part and whether it was a missed opportunity not being a part of that terms of reference.
It's probably broadly known that I support constitutional entrenchment of The Voice. And it's correct that the government only was looking at what a voice would look like. If you look at the way we've designed The Voice in our draft that we're offering up for consultation, it's a voice both to Parliament and to government with parliamentary accountability mechanisms, as I've mentioned. Look, I would personally favour going ahead with constitutional recognition, and many lawyers, including some of those who I notice are participating, have had input into what changes to the Constitution could look like. Many, including the government, thought, let's get the design of the thing done first so that people know what it is that they're looking at. And while the government itself hasn't committed to constitutional change, my hope, and probably I'm being pragmatic here, is that this will make it easier, because then you can dispel the arguments about it being a third chamber. You can dispel the arguments about it somehow creating an inequality. You can say, here's what it is and here's what it will look like once everybody's had their input. And this is the model we're going with. You would need legislation to entrench this body in any event. The Constitution wouldn't do that. The Constitution might say there shall be a body, but it wouldn't create the design features of it. So this is what this process is about, is getting those fundamental design features right. And in legislation, establishing an independent agency that would have certain functions spelt out, have certain purposes and commitment of resourcing. The constitutional argument, I think, is not, I would hope, not killed off by this. It is rather, I hope, enhanced by this.
There was an interesting discussion yesterday in one of these webinars with some members of the local and regional component of The Voice. Daryl, one of the points that Ruth Davies was making about how this is actually a step in, it's not the end of the line, this is a step in the journey, that other things are down the road. You know, we can have other conversations around constitutional entrenchment, around treaty, around fully completing the work called for in the Uluru Statement. What do you say to that?
You might recall at the very beginning I talked about incrementalism, and I do see this as a step in that direction. I too have views around constitutional enshrinement, and I'm supportive of that. This process, though, I think, to rehash what Fiona said, and it's an important point, is thinking about the design features that we create in order to enable voice to occur, and because not every voice in current structures, I believe, is represented. And so this gives us an opportunity to think about how do we fill those gaps, with local and regional people in particular, thinking about where is the gap at local and regional level. Not everybody has a land council system or local decision-making authorities. You know, state by state, territory by territory, are different mechanisms that exist, and they don't cover off on everything. So I think the opportunity to think about design around voice enables us to think through that and to cover those gaps at the same time as not necessarily taking constitutional recognition off the table, but this is a step towards it.
Jeff, when you hear Daryl there talking about there being the opportunities for this to fill gaps that aren't being covered now, I guess that's the point of making submissions, isn't it? That if in your community you're seeing that there's something that's not being done, there's an area that's not being covered, that this may well be an opportunity to have the voice, one of the layers, be a part of that conversation.
Absolutely. And I think that's the whole purpose of The Voice, to recognise Indigenous issues that are not often relevant or recognised by the Parliament, for the Parliament to ask of the Indigenous community through The Voice, what is your views on these matters? As I say, this has been, when I say a long process, not given the length of time the community's been here, but certainly over the last couple of 100 years. We're not going to achieve everything overnight. The Voice is on the table at the moment. It's getting to the point of some sort of conclusion and final design, and I want to see it up. And I want to see it supported by the vast majority of the Indigenous, non-Indigenous community. And then I want to see it working well. And if we can get that far, then I think the next discussion, whatever it may be on, and maybe constitutional recognition, will be a lot easier. I mean, don't forget, the last 20 years, we have seen significant social change and awareness in this country in a way that I've never thought possible. And that's continuing today on other issues. So why is it that the Indigenous people and community cannot have the same respect shown to and of them, and why can't they be given the same opportunity to contribute back into decision making? So this to me is terribly important to get it up and running.
Fiona, Ruth has asked a question, I think, that goes to kind of the legal basis of the voice, saying constitutional reform and recognition is important, but what about the option of a treaty? Could the model proposed advance prospects of a treaty? I guess that all goes down to the kind of legal framework, doesn't it?
The treaty is not in the scope of this conversation, but remember that the Uluru Statement from the Heart said voice first, then treaty conversations, because the idea was that you have an empowered and resourced body able to conduct those treaty conversations. So that makes logical sense to me, that treaty's not off the table either, any more than constitutional recognition is, but the voice gives you a representative body that has authority and legitimacy to have these conversations on behalf of different communities. And, you know, as we see in Victoria and other places, I'm not sure what's happened to the South Australian conversations, but there's an ability at the state level at least, and between different communities, to have their own conversations about treaties and respective overlapping claims, or to have those conversations with the states and territories, regardless of what's happening at a national level. It's just that they wanted, well, the Uluru Statement of the Heart recommended, get the voice going first and then have your treaty conversations and your Makarrata process.
And I don't think we should forget, so Fiona mentioned what they're doing here in Victoria, and that's happening concurrently. But also, from what I've learned in discussions with one of these bodies, is the extraordinary work that's already happening in the ACT, where the Indigenous community there are very involved in giving opinions and being listened to. So there are a number of models around the country that are developing. Some states are behind the others, of Victoria and Canberra, but all of this is a reflection that we are on a fairly major learning curve, which is, I think, delivering some very positive results.
Yeah, and I guess just to add some context, the elected body in the ACT has been around for a couple of years now and is actually detailed at the back of the interim report to the government about co-design processes, along with some of the other models that Jeff was touching on there. And you can go and read up about a lot more detail about that if you want to find out how this model works here and how it might be different, what parts could be plucked from it that might help out to that broader conversation of informing a submission that you might make. We are up against the clock, so I just want to have you all give us final thoughts about what you want Australians that are listening or viewing this now to do. Darryl, I want to start with you on this one.
Okay. The nation-building principles, the first three of them, practical self-rule, or make a decision. Having made a decision, back that decision up with institutions that are capable of delivering on the decision, and that the institutions you create should have cultural match with the people, their values, beliefs and concepts. I think that kind of process there, making decision, build institution, exercise voice through the institution, and that it's consistent with what you believe in, is something that I can see in this voice proposal. It's why ultimately I agreed to be a part of it. As I said earlier, I had to have that debate with myself. And in the South Australian context, what was interesting in the former government, we got to a position over there where they were talking about Aboriginal communities, nations in three categories. There were those who'd been through a nation building approach to then think about how it built out of regional authorities at the time and then into treated groups within South Australia. Now, I think there's the opportunity to think about how do we build from the base and create opportunity for voice and decision making such that it can be of benefit, not just to the Aboriginal community. I think it's in the interests of the broader community to have healthy, well-functioning Aboriginal societies across the country.
Jeff, your final words?
Make it work. if you've got comments, submissions, get them in quickly. We want to progress this. We want to get to a finish point so that we can start again. So to anyone who's viewing today, to those who know people who are interested, please make your submissions. We want to conclude the final design.
And Fiona, final words from you.
Look, over many years, I've seen firsthand the intergenerational impact of laws and practices that have failed our First Nations people. And increasingly they're being imprisoned. Increasingly those numbers include women and children. I've witnessed the devastation of families separated and trauma experienced by children in state care. And I've listened to elders urging our courts to allow traditional culture to be a way that we can proceed to deal with justice issues, trialling justice reinvestment initiatives, for example. I really feel that we must grapple with a way to address self-determination for our First Nations. And this is a model that's on the table. So I urge everybody to engage with the detail of it, to provide their views in the time available. I know it's a short time, but they can be abbreviated views if that's all you've got time for, because I really see the voice as a critical step towards righting the wrongs of our colonial past.
Thank you. And I'll give you some details in just a tick about how to make a submission. But first I want to thank our panellists today, Professor Darryl Rigney, the Honourable Jeff Kennett AC and Ms Fiona McLeod AOSC. Wonderful to have you all along. Thank you for your time today and these conversations on some very big topics we're mulling over that the country is thinking about right now, and also for the work that you've all been doing as part of the broader conversations that are being had in framing a pathway to a voice. So thank you so very much for that. There are a number of ways for you to give feedback. You can complete a survey or provide a submission by going online and heading to voice.niaa.gov.au. And now those submissions close on 31st of March. The surveys will stay open throughout April, and then there'll be another stage and other conversations as well. If you want to find out more, there's plenty of resources, including other videos that detail the local and regional voice, the national voice, the principles behind it, as well as any other conversations that pop up or opportunities for you to have this conversation. So do get involved there. Have a look at where you can find those and where you might be able to get involved yourself. But thank you so very much for joining us and for being a part of this conversation today, and of course over the last number of years, as this is truly a national conversation that, as you've heard there again today, is really the next step in the journey. But of course, this is not the end of the road. This is a part of the longer journey. So thank you so very much for your time. Yarra, good afternoon.